freedom, voice, and choice that I'd like to talk to you about today. As a caveat, I recognize that I am neither scholar nor historian, and that so much of what I plan to talk about today is steeped in nuance that I will necessarily omit. I'd like to start by reflecting on an audio interview I heard yesterday between Shamita Basu, host of Apple News Today, and David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker. On its face, it was an interview about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in its depths, it was about so much more. It was an open and honest conversation about what denying history and voice and choice does to a country and its prospects, what it does to the dreams and hopes of its people. Towards the end of the interview, Basu asked Remnick if the conflict in Ukraine reminds him of another point in history from which we can learn. Remnick, who won the Pulitzer for his book, Lenin's Tomb, The Last Days of the Soviet Era, says that this moment reminds him of 1987, when Mikhail Gorbachev realized that for the Soviet Union to pull itself out of poverty and to develop technologically and culturally, it had to open itself up. And part of opening itself up meant the honest and open study of history, which meant learning about the nation's most painful and darkest episodes alongside its triumphs. Without any prompting, Remnick articulated a point that hits close to home for those of us sitting in this room today. He said, "Look at us Americans, fighting really seriously over the battle of history. What we're teaching our kids about the legacy of slavery or Jim Crow. But here in America," he said, "at least for now, there is no dictator in place to be the official historian." I'll come back to this point about the identity of an official historian or spokesperson later. As Remnick pivots back to Putin, he explains that rather than reap the benefits of an intellectually free society, Putin started to winnow the aperture of history. In sum, Putin began to close the window of truth, and in doing so, he started to manufacture false historical narratives. Those notions, denying a full and honest history, and the curbing of truth, voice, and choice, are the very concepts that the ACLU of Louisiana fights against daily. Most current and imminent to those of us in this room is the battle being waged over redistricting. This is a battle that centers on the very themes I have already sought to highlight, namely, recognizing this nation's history and providing voice and choice to the people the Voting Rights Act was implemented to protect. Every 10 years, new political maps are drawn as part of the redistricting process by using census data. This process determines the allocation of political power, representation, and ultimately, resource access at every level of government across the country. And the maps remain in place until the following cycle, 10 years later. This is the first redistricting cycle since the enactment of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 without pre-clearance. Pre-clearance required states like Louisiana with an extensive history of racial discrimination in voting to get their maps approved by a federal court or the U.S. Department of Justice. Without pre-clearance, Louisiana and other states are in the process of enacting racially discriminatory maps to silence Black voters. To recap, over a week ago, lawmakers in Louisiana approved new congressional and legislative maps that undermine political representation of Black Louisianans. Given that the state is 1/3 Black, Louisiana's African American voters should have the opportunity to choose at least 2 of its 6 representatives that go to Congress, not 1. They should have the opportunity to potentially gain 3 more seats in the state Senate, and between 6 and 9 new seats in the House. The governor has the power to do what the Voting Rights Act demands at this juncture: veto the current maps. It's imperative that all Louisianans, just like the Ukrainians that are fighting right now, have a fair shot at electing representatives who will fight for their concerns, both in Congress and here in Louisiana. There is simply no legitimate justification for drawing maps that deny Black voters an opportunity to elect representatives who will fight for them in critical State House deliberations. We are learning from a war playing out on the international stage what happens when a government represses the voices of its constituents, when the government does not represent the choice of the people. That government starts to act unilaterally, claiming paternalistically that it knows what's best for the people. Right here, at home, the voices of Louisianans are being ignored. The people of Louisiana spoke to their legislators at roadshows across the state. The people of Louisiana made clear what they wanted: additional majority Black opportunity districts, both at the congressional level and at the state level. We now have a Black woman, the first former public defender, who will potentially sit on the highest court in the land. Her presence there will allow the United States Supreme Court to reflect the composition of this nation more accurately. But just as her representation on the highest court in the land matters, so too does the composition of this state's lawmakers. But the people's voices and calls for proportional representation have been ignored. Nonetheless, now those voices are again speaking up. Those voices are asking the governor to do what the legislature failed to do: heed to the will of the people and abide by the Voting Rights Act. Governor Edwards has both the ability and the duty to protect the Black vote and reject maps that undermine the political power of Black Louisianans. The governor has the freedom to do so. Zelensky has shown the world what a true leader looks like when he stands up. When his back is against the wall, he does not cower. He fights. Against the odds, he fights. And in doing so, Zelensky has changed the trajectory of what many thought was a predetermined early outcome. Governor Edwards can, indeed he must, display the very same leadership here. The people who elected him, the Black voters who so desperately need his backing now, entrusted him with the power to veto repressive laws. Should the governor choose not to reject the current maps, he will be turning his back on his people. These maps, which will become law until the next census, a decade from now, have a significant impact on people's everyday rights, rights that are under assault. In the end, the people elected to Congress and to the state legislature have control over introducing and passing laws that affect the people of this state. Transgender rights, for example, are under attack. These attacks, sadly, overwhelmingly focus on youth and schools. Legislators are trying to make being trans shameful, but laws won't. Indeed, they can't stop youth from being trans. Such laws will only make it harder for our kids to grow up at all, and make it harder to access the support, the education, and community that all young people deserve. Growing up is hard for everyone, and some politicians are pushing policies that leave trans youth behind. Laws that deny voice and choice to the people fall in line with dictates heard from repressive regimes across the world. They fall in line with dictators who want to narrate official histories untethered to reality. That is not who we are as a nation. Young people should have the freedom to explore who they are and to be supported in reaching for their dreams. It is not the job of a politician or a school to police a student's gender and to put students in boxes. Indeed, doing so does nothing to advance civil society. Nothing. Here's what trans adults say. Being trans is beautiful. Life's problems don't come from being trans. They come from barriers to living openly and authentically. If politicians want to help youth, they need to make sure young people know that they belong, that they see themselves reflected in their books and curriculum. And like everyone, that they are respected for who they are. Voice and choice. Open and honest dialogue about the history of this country's repression of those who do not fit a predetermined mold is paramount. Indeed, according to the 64 Parishes Project, residents who would now identify as queer have existed in Louisiana since before its founding. But in Louisiana, and I'm still quoting, the political movement for LGBTQ rights emerged slowly throughout the late 20th century, as compared to other American states with sizable queer populations. This delay was largely a holdover of French and Creole influenced traditions, creating an unspoken social compact wherein non-heterosexual behavior could be accommodated so long as it remained apolitical and private. In short, silenced. Denying reality, the existence of people who do not fit a certain mold only takes us further away from the ideals of a free and fair society. It turns us into a country that seeks to promote false historical narratives. It turns us into a country that is not intellectually free. It turns us into a country that does not believe in voice and choice. Unfortunately, other rights are also on the chopping block, including reproductive freedom. Abortion bans may be on the horizon, considering pending questions over the future of Roe v. Wade. But what we must acknowledge in the face of this reality and the pending redistricting fight is the following. Lack of reproductive freedom falls hardest on Black women, due to egregious disparities in maternal mortality rates. According to a 2020 study published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, in Louisiana, Black women are 4.1 times more likely to die while pregnant or within 42 days of childbirth as white women. Moreover, abortion bans aren't without economic costs. Abortion restrictions, as identified by the Institute for Women's Policy Research, already cost Louisiana's economy $1.8 billion per year. At bottom, nearly 11,000 women, ages 15 to 44, could enter the workforce if the existing state restrictions on abortion were not in place. Staying true to the principles on which this nation was founded should not mean that we reject the truth about our country's founding or its past. It does not mean we overturn legal precedent where we fear the power of giving everyday people a voice and choice in the trajectory of this nation. Rewriting our nation's history by dominating and quashing the voices of those most marginalized by aspects of our country's errant past is not the answer. We have something extraordinarily significant to celebrate today. The nomination of what will hopefully be the first Black woman and former public defender to sit on the United States Supreme Court of America. But celebrating that reality does not end the fight against the assaults on the voice and choice of Louisianans to choose their lawmakers, and therefore the laws that will ultimately bind them. In the face of these challenges, challenges that cut at the soul of this nation, we at the ACLU of Louisiana are fighting. We are fighting alongside those who seek to ensure that the voice and choice upon which this country was founded stay intact. Voice and choice. These are the very principles we see Ukrainians fighting so hard to preserve. Voice and choice. These are the very same principles Louisianans are fighting for in seeking to ensure fairness in the redistricting process. A process that will have a trickle effect on the voice and choice of Louisianans over the next 10 years. Thank you.
Throughout the redistricting session, the GOP led with the argument that, if it's a minority district and it's not at least 57, 58% Black, that it wouldn't perform. Would you say that this argument is going to stand up in court for the reason not to create these new districts?
I think it's hard whether to say that argument will stand up in court, as we've recently seen, but what I will say is that the analyses that have been done show that that 57% rate is not accurate, and it's much closer to 50 to 52 than it is to 57. So at bottom, that argument does not appear to pass muster on the numbers.
And there's been multiple redistricting fights in other states that have already gone to the courts. How are you kind of feeling that some of those may be able to apply to what is happening here in Louisiana, if you have any examples?
Well, I think we know what's happening in the courts. We saw what happened in Alabama. We know that a 3-district court judge panel found that the maps that had been passed by the legislature effectively violated the Voting Rights Act. And then we saw that go up to the United States Supreme Court, and the court basically said any change is too close to the upcoming midterm elections, so we're going to basically punt and decide that question later. So we don't, at this point, have a definitive decision on where the court will come out with respect to Section 2, but it is concerning that timing is turning into an issue. And we also know that there are other questions that courts have raised just about who has the right to bring these cases in the first place. And right now, for the first time, there's a question about whether it can only be the Attorney General of the United States, or whether, as we have seen for decades, whether it can be everyday citizens and groups seeking to ensure that the Voting Rights Act is being implemented.
If I might follow up on that, the question of timing, could you lay out for us something of a timeline, when the governor must act and when the legislature presumably could consider, contemplate a veto, and how that would affect any possible legal action?
Yeah, so what we're looking at is the governor has 20 days from the date the maps are before him to veto them. And right now, our organization and many other coalition partners have asked that he do so. And we've provided him with a legal analysis as to why the current maps violate Section 2. Whether he will enact a veto as to the congressional map and the state legislative map, or whether he will do one and not the other, that's a question that we're waiting for. But our position would be that he needs to reject both maps, and he needs to do so now. And if he does, then we will be in a position where the current maps do not currently stand. Now, if there is no veto, or if there is a veto override, then we are likely going to look at litigation in this area as well.
At Sound Off Louisiana, we've gotten what we deem to be pretty credible reports that in a meeting with the Legislative Black Caucus that there was basically an agreement that we won't join in any impeachment efforts in exchange for a consulting firm coming in with regard to state police. How concerned are you that the life of Ronald Greene may be being used as a bargaining chip in this whole redistricting process?
I think the sad reality is that many things are used as bargaining chips in the redistricting process, and Ronald Greene's life should not be a part of that calculus. There are many serious issues that are surrounding Ronald Greene's death, including what the Louisiana State Police knew and when, what others knew and when, and that is a separate issue, and that needs separate repercussions than tying that to what is happening with redistricting.
Thank you.
What's the timeline on when we might see litigation? I've heard that litigation would be right immediately after the governor makes any action, whether that's vetoing the bill or signing the bill, that you don't need to wait for a veto override session to take action. Would you expect after the governor's decisions come down that we'll see a flurry of litigation after that? Or what are you anticipating?
I think litigation is always hard to definitively say lawsuits will be filed on this day, but I think it's going to be very much dependent on when and if we see a veto. So if we have to wait for the maps to be enacted into law because we're not going to see a veto, then we're likely going to see litigation very close to that 20-day mark. Now, if we start to see a veto on one or both maps, that changes the calculus of the timing. But I think we can comfortably say that within the next month, there's likely to be litigation on one or both maps in the state if we do not see the veto, which we are strongly emphasizing is the right way to go here.
And they made some attempts to draw a new Supreme Court map with, only one district or two districts, but none of them were ultimately voted on by the House and the Senate. And so the last time we had our Supreme Court redistricted was through a court case. Would you say that that's probably what it's going to take to get new districts for our state Supreme Court?
Well, right now, there is a court case that has been reopened, the Chisholm case, based on a decision that came down from the Fifth Circuit a couple months ago. And the Fifth Circuit effectively told the state that the consent decree that has been in place for years should maybe not be in place anymore. So there is active current litigation over the future of that consent decree right now. And so I think the answer is that question is currently before the court, so we don't have to wait to see whether there's going to be litigation, but when we'll get an answer to that, that's a separate question.
If Governor Edwards does fail in your, call or challenge to him to veto these maps, do you foresee even any members of the Legislative Black Caucus joining with Republicans in an impeachment effort?
I have to honestly say I don't know the answer to that.
Fair enough.
What will you do if the Supreme Court decides that rules that organizations such as yours lack the standing to sue?
Well, I think there are always active conversations with those who may have standing to see whether they're willing to get involved. So I think in Louisiana, we're going to have to wait and see whether the Justice Department is going to actively get involved here. What I would say happened in Alabama was a bit of a surprise. And I would hope that the Department of Justice now is thinking very critically about where it might want to intervene or bring a lawsuit so that that question of standing isn't one that we have to entertain and that we can just get to the merits as quickly as possible.
Representative Barry Ivy proposed one map that was apparently tabled, not even put into consideration, and he was lampooned fairly strongly by members of his own party in that regard. Would that map have been agreeable, or do you know the details of it to know if that would have been an acceptable map from?
Right at this moment, I don't. I do remember Representative Ivy and his speech and how he was upset about how he was treated, but at this moment, I don't have before me that map.
Any other questions?
What is your perception of the abortion cases that the High Court is likely to review in Mississippi and in Texas, and how that will compute in Louisiana?
Well, I think as we all know, Louisiana has a trigger law, right? So the trigger ban effectively means that if we see Roe v. Wade overturned, we will actively have an abortion ban in this state. What we do know is that we don't have a definitive decision on the Texas law. What we've seen is a lot of punting, and it's very similar to what we've seen with the voting rights cases, which is we're not going to decide this issue now. There's more that needs to be done before we reach a decision. But that does get us to the Mississippi case and what kind of decision we might see on a 15-week abortion ban. And it's our position that that is not a controversial case, that we have case law that is extremely clear, that the question is about viability, and that 15 weeks falls well short of the 24 weeks where one can actually start to consider viability of an embryo. So we will have to wait and see. I will say that my honest hope is that this court knows that they are not a political body, and as such, it would not be prudent, wise, or in the interest of the nation to overturn Roe v. Wade. Rather, I'm hoping that if there is anything that happens, there will be an attempt to stay in alignment with the law of the land, and that this court is not going to backtrack. But if it does, I am, again, hoping that we're not going to see a regression in the rights of women to choose reproductive freedom.